So we're back again at the end of the month, the final Friday, with my good friends, Steve and Krys down in North Carolina. Welcome back to the show. Today we got an interesting little appetizer. We got a bit of a brief run today, just to kind of whet people's appetite a little bit. And we're going to be talking about John Dee, who is considered one of the great maguses of, well, perhaps history. And you guys have developed kind of a fascination and an interest in Dee's work lately. And you brought the idea to bring Dee to the sort of the show and get into it. And let's do it. Thanks for coming on, Steve and Krys.
Good to see you, Robert. Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity, as always, to come and chat with your audience, your wonderful audience. So we appreciate that. Yeah, I'm going to just quickly, so I guess what we'd like to do, because this is probably something that's going to run at least a couple of shows, and we'll do a sort of a quick intro. Okay. What we want to do is, because we were sort of in this place of just complete negativity and just everything spiritual has been turned on its head. It's kind of like what we wanted to do last week with Nicholas Roerich. We're interested in what is was there a sort of esoteric and spiritual beginning to America? Was there some sort of spiritual intent for what happened here? And I think that's really important to do. And maybe it's good to be starting this on the eclipse when maybe we can eclipse some of the old, negative being paradigm and start, finding out our origins and maybe our sacred origins. And that's kind of what I've been liking to do with the history of Western civilization and Western philosophy. But we can do this specifically with America. And so Krys will give you a quick update of how we kind of, got caught up into this sort of thing.
Yeah, I guess, we've been introduced to this quite some time ago, and kind of in the course of our amblings and inquiries into spiritual practice. And so we would sort of amble in and out of Western and Eastern philosophies. And I did take some classes on alchemy here in Asheville. I was very fortunate to study with Vincent Wren, and he's a real traditionalist when it comes to learning the spagyrics and the background and what have you. So I was familiar with John Dee's name and some of his work, but fortunately, Randy Moggins was doing an interview with Jason Louv, I guess it was about a month ago, and we clicked into it and thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I would highly recommend it. Anyone who wants to have some kind of background on what's going on here, go ahead and check on Randy's show that day.
Off Planet Radio.
Off Planet Media, I guess it is. And then as he was interviewing Jason Louv, who has just written a book called John Dee and the Empire of Angels, he got into a lot of the background, and then he gave a wonderful story about how, as he's doing all this research and all these studies on John Dee, he lived in an apartment complex, and he had been there for quite some time. And just by happenstance, got into a conversation with his neighbor across the hall, who had been living there for a while as well. And he said, "Oh, what are you up to? And what are you up to?" And, "Well, I do a lot of research on this guy named John Dee." And the guy says, "Really? So am I." So it turns out this is Alan Green, who's a Brit who lives in America, and I guess they're out in LA. Mm-hmm. And so they got into this delicious conversation about their research. And they had both been in the apartment complex as neighbors for, I don't know how many years, but years. So they got a big kick out of that, and then they exchanged stories and exchanged information. So we then started to pull the thread on Alan Green and went to his site and learned what he's up to. And then he's getting into how this steganography, not exsteganography, that's another show, but steganography, which is a form of cryptography that has the encryption out in the open, where it's there for all to see, but you have to have eyes to see it and background to recognize it. So he was doing that work on Shakespeare and making connections with Shakespeare and that whole stream. So then we went down that other rabbit hole. 26 minutes. And so that's what got us excited about this whole thing. So we picked up Jason Louv's book, started reading that, and that led us to think, well, maybe this would be something that we could share with the greater community. And I would highly recommend that people really go out and chase down that interview just to get some background, so when we go into it next month, they'll have some understanding of where it's coming from.
Okay. So you guys got turned on through the Randy Moggins piece, but there was always, excuse me, there was already something sort of brewing, because we were talking about Rourke, we're talking about Bacon, which leads us back to Dee. So let's just set the stage briefly. Maybe you want to jump in, Steve, and kind of give people sort of a snapshot of Dee and, you know, where he came from and how he rose to prominence during the court of Queen Elizabeth I.
Well, yeah, I guess part of what I wanted to do was sort of a larger background of how of the philosophies that were impinging on Dee when he came to be. But I can say a few things first off the bat: that he was Queen Elizabeth's court astrologer. He was an alchemist. He spent the end of his life talking in discourse with angels through this person who was semi-disreputable named Edward Kelly, I guess the jury's still kind of out on him and how real that connection is, and I think that's what we hope to get into at some point. But Dee was the main mathematician of his time. He did the astrology for Queen Elizabeth's coronation date. He may or may not have done a little magic when the Spanish Armada came in. He may have done a little weather magic. It's kind of hard to say. But he was...
So I just want to jump in there.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point, because every time Spain came to fight the English and approached with their great ships, the weather was just horrible.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And they were defeated even before they could, fire, a cannon shot or a broadside. And it was consistent. So, was he summoning, some weather magic? I mean, it's quite possible, because you would think that at some point the odds would line up with the Spaniards and they'd actually get good weather to attack, and they never did.
Right. And in fact, this is why a lot of people think that Shakespeare's, and then the other aspect of this is who was Shakespeare. That gets into that too, and what Dee's influence on that. But Dee is considered by most people the character of Prospero in Shakespeare's last play.
Midsummer Night's Dream, right?
No. Geez, where'd I go? The Tempest. Geez.
The Tempest,
which is a magnificent play. But so the character of Prospero in The Tempest controls the weather, and in fact controls an air spirit, Ariel, and causes. And then when his the people who originally exiled him and stole his kingdom, he causes the weather to shipwreck them. So whoever Shakespeare is encoded that aspect of things into this last play, The Tempest. So it seems like that was one of his bags of tricks, and I don't have the dates of that offhand, but the thing with Dee is that he's just he's a person that got kind of written out of history in any sense, because and even in his own lifetime, because basically he spent at least the last third of his lifetime pretty much destitute at his house. And one of the things he also had was the largest, I believe, personal library in the world at that time. So whereas he had something like 5,000 volumes, the Oxford University would have like half that in their library. So he was obviously a polymath, is completely learned in a whole bunch of different areas. And it's funny, it's going a completely different direction than I had planned, but this is okay. So the question, one of the questions that we want to ask and explore is this whole notion of Rosicrucianism and America. And so Dee was hugely influential with some of these early things that were written, Rosicrucian tracts that were written in and around 1614, 15, and 16. And they were manifestos, in fact. And they were really interesting because, amongst other things, it was a complete salvo against the Pope. They literally said the Pope is the Antichrist, and the Jesuits are evil, and not too different than what a fair number of people might be saying these days too. But so Dee's and Francis Bacon comes into this too, but their influence comes in to these Rosicrucian manifestos. And the odd thing though is that really no one has come up. No, there are no there's no real evidence of an actual Rosicrucian group until much later. So the question is, the manifestos were written anonymously, though at least one of them, the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, is fairly well attributed to someone. The question is, what it seems like the fact of the manifestos might have created Rosicrucianism, because people were flipping out in Europe. There were a lot of people who were into alchemy, into astrology, into all these things, and they had to do it fairly much underground, especially after Queen Elizabeth died. Now, Queen Elizabeth was allowed Dee to do his thing, even though it was kind of against a lot of church dictates. She kind of let him do his thing and fostered a fair amount of alchemy within her kingdom, especially since it abetted her in times of war, apparently. But when her successor James I hits the throne in 1604, I'm not absolutely sure, but sometime around that time, King James is much more of a Puritan and very much against alchemy. And his fortune seemed to slip at that time, and also the movements on continental Europe, inspired by these Rosicrucian manifestos. All these people would just come out of the woodwork and say, "Where are these people? They have some kind of wisdom. We want to know what it is. We want to join their group," but no one is able to find anybody. And then soon after that, by 1620, when actually King James's daughter and her husband, Prince Frederick, they were sort of like the golden couple, and they were really interested in alchemy, and they wanted to reestablish really the alchemical base in Prague, which is a place where Dee went back and forth a number of times earlier in his lifetime. But just after that, they really wanted to establish, this kingdom, this alchemical kingdom. And what happened was she was expecting her father, King James of England, to help her in this, and he abandoned her, and they got squashed and basically spent the rest of their lives with their court in exile in The Hague in the Netherlands. So there was a squashing there of the alchemical movement, and it seems that there was a movement also at that time to start this sort of thing in America, and by certain people, including Dee and possibly Bacon, to make America this sort of place. Now, Dee had all sorts of things about Northwest Passage in America, and he comes up with what did you want to say something about it?
I was just remembering, and Sir Walter Raleigh comes into play, doesn't he?
So there are a number of esoteric groups in England, which had to be esoteric, but there was this seems to be this movement that they wanted to make America, because it was seen as this, blank slate, even though the natives apparently didn't. But for a lot of the English, and this is one of the things that Dee tried to convince Queen Elizabeth of, that this is the direction that they should go. So there are some things in America that point to this, and the most notable one is the tower in Newport. So, and the Newport Tower is easy to find pictures of, and it's also called Dee's Tower because apparently John Dee designed it. And there is a line, a really interesting line that runs from the Michael Ley line in England. Now the Michael Ley line is sometimes called the Dragon Line in England. I don't want to get too far afield, but most of the main Druidic and then following that church sites are along this line going out from Cornwall, and it points right to the United States, and it happens to cross this tower.
Very close. We're
in
very
Newport.
close to the tower. Yeah.
So, so there seems to be something about the placement of the tower, and then there are certain like holes in the design of the tower that work through certain alignments. As all the stone monuments do, work with usually solstices and equinoxes, and the light falls in certain places. So there is something that was built, and it's still kind of mysterious as to when and who built the tower. Originally, it was thought that it was done by the Vikings, but it seems like it was an early trip, maybe in the 1560s, to the United States when this tower was built in this particular place. So there are artifacts, and then there are also people. For example, John Winthrop the Younger, who basically was the governor of Connecticut, who wanted to establish New London as a new alchemical city. And then you have other groups in Pennsylvania, probably not too far from where you were, I think in Bucks County, that established these monasteries based on Rosicrucian principles. So there's a lot there to play with. I'm trying to cram things in. There you go.
Good, there's the tower.
So there are all sorts of movements with the windows. I don't know if there was originally a roof to it. I think it's 8. I think it has 8 apertures. And I also have to stress that this is basically we're in progress in unearthing these things. That's why we kind of just wanted to introduce it today and just talk a little bit about it. And Krys is the one who's been reading the book on Dee. I don't know if you have some more to add.
Yeah, I could actually.
Krys, what I'd be really interested in, maybe you could shed some light on this, is how does he rise to prominence in the court?
It was not easy. I'm not exactly sure how the initial entree was into the court, but the competition was so fierce. There were many astrologers at the time who were doing the same kind of work as he was, but somehow he seemed to gain the favor of Queen Elizabeth.
I think he knew her before she was queen.
Yeah, quite possibly. But there was a lot of vindictiveness against him. He had actually gone to Cambridge and was educated there, and got into some shenanigans. There's a story that I can't quite remember exactly how it went, and I'll have that for the next time we talk. But, also he was thrown into prison in the Tower of London and tortured in his younger days. So it was not an easy entree, and it was a bumpy ride. And he could never quite win enough favor with the Queen to get some kind of a stipend that he could depend upon. That's why he was always in some kind of a financial distress. So he would go back and forth to the continent to try to get some kind of patronage for his work, and then come back again to England. So yes, he did have the ear of the Queen, but it seems like it wasn't always just him, that there were others who were really in fierce competition with him. So
I think, and Bacon's another one who was also relatively poor too.
was he?
You know, and also spent some time in the Tower. I guess everyone had to pay their dues, spend some time in the Tower during that time.
But even with his poverty-stricken financial system, he still managed to have this tremendous collection of books. So it seems like any extra money that he ever could get his hands on went into his inner work, and he really building his internal economics rather than external. And that was where his focus was more important to him.
Do you think Queen Elizabeth I was a man?
I had never thought of it. I don't know. I have no idea.
That's actually kind of a fairly popular rumor.
Yeah.
Is that so?
Yeah, but I heard that one, and I've also heard that Bacon is her illegitimate son. That's another one of the rumors. You know.
Yeah, I'm open. You know.
Somehow it doesn't ring for me. You know.
How would I know?
And you know, geez, all those Elizabeths live quite the long life. There's like two of them, I guess.
I mean, just from a standpoint that if she was actually a man, and Bacon knew clearly he would have an inside track on court astrologer. I don't know whether she is or not, but it's been tossed around at that.
Yeah, and there were also so many, you know, rumors about her affairs with various people whose names I don't recall offhand.
Well, she had an affair with, wasn't it? Was it Sir Walter Raleigh, right?
Did she?
Well, and I heard she had a favorite, Robert something or another. Now I can't remember the last name.
Yeah. So in the movie Elizabeth, which is actually a pretty good movie.
Yep.
She has an affair with Raleigh. And she sends him to America. And
that would be worth watching again.
Yeah, well, and Raleigh, of course, is another one involved, and he also had one of these, you know, secret esoteric groups. There were a number of them. And there's another one by Sir Philip Sidney that Giordano Bruno figures heavily within, and Giordano Bruno and John Dee were kind of in the same ballpark as astrologers and magi, because Giordano Bruno is really interesting. He gets burned at the stake by the Catholic Church, pretty much within nose shot of Galileo, which is why Galileo recanted his findings of the Earth revolving around the sun. You know, he certified Copernicus's work.
Right.
But Giordano Bruno is another one, and he was actually in London for a long time. I don't know about his relationships with John Dee, but they seem to be cut from the same cloth. And maybe at some point I go to the antecedents of that, but the thing that runs through them very strongly is this understanding of nature. So it's like a what's called a pantheism, I guess.
Right.
Everything in nature is alive and
as a spirit.
Divine.
Yeah.
And of course, if you're going to do magic, you have to have that as sort of a background, you know, for anything. So and this is why, of course, the Catholic Church did not like that, because they were loved to enforce that strict separation between God and the world, which comes out of Thomas Aquinas to a great deal in the 1200s. So they loved that strict separation because otherwise you wouldn't need them to get to God. If God was everywhere, who the hell needs a church, right? You know, most of us probably feel that way.
Right. They wanted to stay in control of their form of magic.
That's their so it's always the opposing forms of magic, right? So there's the dark magic of control.
It tends to be sort of a dynamic between Saturn and Uranus.
Yeah.
Not Saturn and Jupiter, but Saturn and Uranus. You know, the classic battle between Uranus and Kronos, right?
Right. The father and the son.
Yeah, yeah.
You know.
So the roots really of Dee's Hermetic philosophy and a lot of the ideas that were kind of spreading in the underground intellectual circles in Europe at that time could be attributed to like Enochian magic, right? What do you think?
Well, yeah, though. Well, you were going to answer that.
What?
Do you want to answer that?
I'm sorry.
About
I'm sorry. I was distracted by Jasper. Would you repeat the question?
So
please?
about Enochian magic.
What do you want to know?
Well, we were talking, Steve and I were tossing around this idea that the ideas that were becoming popular in Europe in an underground sort of way, right, with the mystics and the alchemists, that the source material for that was Enochian magic.
Okay, so that's the language of the angels,
right?
And that comes in with before Edward Kelly, but that really clicked in when he and Edward Kelly hooked up.
But Dee never called it that.
Okay.
Right. I'm just throwing that in.
That came later. The actual term came later, but it was the Enochian language of the angels, and you're right. He never called it that. But this character, Edward Kelly, shows up, and they're doing all this incredible work, and he was a pretty powerful, maybe a little bit on the dark side.
Well, so the rumor is that Kelly's a summoner, right?
Yeah.
And that's what separated him from Dee. Like Dee was kind of this elemental sort of magician. You know, he could play with things like sulfur and you do tricks and, you know, maybe get into a little weather magic. But Kelly brought the summoning magic. And it
seems like it was within the first 15 minutes of their getting, you know, into their work together that, you know, the angel came in. And then there's this whole thing with the demonic angel that comes in.
We're doing circle work. I mean, that's what Kelly is bringing to John Dee's life is circle work.
Yeah.
And that comes out of that whole, it's sort of Enochian, but also the Babylonian tradition. And this is where King Solomon was sort of not just the king and the ruler and the emperor, but he was a magician. Solomon was a summoner.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where he got the majority of his power. So this is a Babylonian sort of technique that was, it wasn't popularized, but clearly was used to gain access and information. It was the dark web before the dark web was the dark web.
It really was. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And then they were getting messages from the angels, actually very specific instructions on how to build their sacred table to do their work with.
Yes.
And it had very specific dimensions. It was a cube-like piece of furniture, and then it had all the sigils around the outside and sigils on top, and they would do their work and do this very devout praying before they went into their work and summon the angels. And then this whole language was coming through.
Right.
And it was apparently a language that, you know, had syntax and grammar, and it was very highly structured as a language, an independently existing language, not independently existing, but independent of other systems.
Right.
And it had its own structure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It had its own integrity as a language.
Well, that's when, so when Kelly shows up, that's when Dee really changes his game.
Very much so.
And I'm not sure if it's for the better, right? Because it seems like, and you could correct me, but it seems like after the Kelly thing sort of collapses, John Dee's life starts to take a bit of a turn for the worse. And he starts to go into this kind of darker period and begins to experience things like destitution and trying to find another court and all that stuff, right? I think it's on the back end of the Kelly meeting. Yeah. Is that what you found?
Well, they traveled to Prague together also, and tried to, Rudolph II, who was in Prague, I think. So they went that route. They went to various places in Europe, apparently Poland too. There were certain princes who were supporting that kind of work and interested in magic and what they were bringing. But that's something that we're going to, so we haven't fully delved into that. So I can't be too specific about what was going on. But the general feeling is, there's a lot of questions about it, certainly.
Yeah, he certainly has to go, hat in hand to the continent looking for financial help just to support his life.
Yeah.
And apparently Kelly spent every penny they had in brothels and what have you. He had lost his ears because he was caught counterfeiting. So it was kind of I just want to connect briefly to Dee's predecessor, someone known by the name of Paracelsus.
Yeah, I was going to bring Paracelsus up.
Right. So Paracelsus was Swiss. His actual name, Theophrastus von Hohenheim. So Paracelsus is easier, but he's kind of like a generation before Dee, and he's an alchemist. And a couple of things I found really interesting about him, I was going to do a couple of quotes, and there's a couple of things that he was trained in mining, and you find this coming up over and over again. And also when I talked about John Winthrop, he was also John Winthrop Jr. and his esoteric Connecticut. He was also involved in mining, and this sort of metallurgy as a sacred art seems to show up in the background a lot of things, and you can even trace it back to Joseph of Arimathea, who was a tin miner, and there are supposed extra biblical tales of him bringing the Christ on his trips as a young man during the so-called lost years to Glastonbury and to England to work with the mining. So that's one thing. But one of the things that Paracelsus realized, that you couldn't get the real education from the university. He said the high colleges managed to produce high asses. And he said you have to learn from old wives, gypsies, sorcerers, wanderers, dervishes, and outlaws. So that also connects back to this sort of Edward Kelly and this, this sort of outlier.
Well, so we're talking about the left-handed path here is really what we're
and it's
to, unpack.
And it's and the left-handed path is the most dangerous. It is the most is the most
lead to obliteration.
Yeah.
But
Paracelsus went all the way to Turkey, looking for wisdom, and throughout the Egypt and Arabia, and picking up what he could from dervishes and what have you. And again, he's back with the healing with Natura. He was taught by
the goddess Natura.
Yeah, the goddess Natura, which I was going to try to get into. The goddess Natura shows up in the school of Chartres. So there is a sort of feminine aspect to this. But one of the other things is, but he was also a great healer. And he was taught by Trithemius, who was also a big influence on John Dee,
who was a German teacher.
And also one of the things that he was interested in was discoursing with angels. And you can maybe want to talk, and he had this process of making plant essences, and he used dew. And maybe this is kind of a good place to end up, because I know we don't have a lot of time, or we can at least wind up. So I found this really interesting in Frances Yates' books, and Frances Yates was this woman who died, I think, in the mid-70s or something, but she's kind of like the main scholar of Elizabethan times, Elizabethan magic, Rosicrucianism, things like that. But what Paracelsus did, and he would actually put like glass plates out overnight and collect the dew off of them. And the dew was imbued with the overnight and with the qualities of the sky and who knows what else.
And then you would take the plant material and then you would burn it down, and you would have the ash of the plant material. You would mix it with the dew, and then you would reconstruct it. And so they have that whole, dissolution and then coagulation, which is the big alchemical process. And then the resulting product is called a spagyric. And a spagyric could be loosely associated with tincture. It's a medication. You could say it's like a cross between homeopathy and tincture, but it contains the plant essence and spirit in a very different quality. So when you ingest it, it's giving like the life force and the real essence of the plant, whatever that is. But that's called a spagyric.
Well, this is some good source material, some good background on Dee. And the next time we get together, we'll really stretch out and kind of explore his influence with the court and some of his influence on the founding of America. So I'm looking forward to that next one.
Yeah. And I did find one little tidbit about his astrology. There is no official record of John Dee's birth date and location, but his own diaries tell us that he was born in the city of London, and that it was on July 13th, just past, 1527, and it was 4:02 p.m.
Yeah, I saw that. We'll throw that chart up next time.
Yeah, it might be interesting. I think it'd be interesting.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed is he had Pluto and Capricorn in his chart. And it's at 21 degrees, and we're approaching Pluto and Capricorn at 21 degrees.
Wow.
So maybe that's why there's some John Dee
resonance going
around right now. So.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah. So
all right.
good.
So that's a good
jump
in the lake there.
Yeah. So maybe we'll solve the question.
Actually, his place was called Mortlake.
Yes, right. His home was called Mortlake, Death Lake.
Mortlake, Death Lake. Well, Steve and Krys, it's been great to have you back on again. Logosophia Books.com, right? Or Logosophia. I always get this mixed up.
Books.
Yeah. Logosophiabooks.com.
And you can find their material there, all the books that they produce, including Steve's book, which is fantastic, Katabatic Wind. And he's going to go get a book.
Oh, he's going to go and show you.
There it is.
There it is, Diana.
That's a really great book.
Yeah, and here's the John Dee book.
John Dee Angels. Hey, listen, gotta go.
All right.
Okay.
Wish
See you in a
everybody.
month.
Okay.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Great.